So we're going to be building out this example right here where we are syncing operations between two Slate.js editors. So as I'm typing in one of them, it will make changes in the other and vice versa. And we're going to add one other touch to this to make it even better. The code that they have, the sample code, works for two editors. We're going to generalize this so it works for any number of editors. So if we have 10 people that want to collaborate, it works the same way. So if you click on view source on this example, and I'll put this link in the description below, you can see the source code for that example that we're going to base it off of. So keep this handy because we're going to be coming back to this and referencing a few pieces of the code. Alright, so this is where we left off. We just got a simple editor rendering here, and so we're going to start from there. So I didn't really go over this, but we have this initial value in our code, and if we change the value of this, this is basically the initial structure of our editor, at least the data that is inside of it. And you can see the text here matches what the text is over there. So we can change that, but don't let this intimidate you. This may look large, but this is basically how Slate.js internally stores the data, or at least is one way. This is one representation of it. And so we're going to just split everything up into a few different files to make this easier. So I'm going to say slate initial value.ts, and we're going to just export const this value. And we're going to import value from Slate, give it a save, and now we're going to move our editor into a component. That way we can render multiple of these. So we're going to say syncing editor.tsx, and I'm going to say syncing editor. And here I'm going to basically just paste the code that we have here and move it over. And I can grab these imports. We're gonna have no props for now, but we may update this at a later point. And then here we're just going to say return, and then we're going to render our syncing editor. And we can get rid of these imports. We don't need them anymore. Alright, and so the idea is once we get this syncing editor to work, we can render a couple of them. Something like this. And we can render more than one, and then we're going to see multiple editors syncing. But we're going to just focus on one editor at first. So coming back to our syncing editor here, we're going to import initial value from that file right there. And the way I just brought that up, so I don't know if you saw that, but I have my cursor here, I do command period, and that brings up this little menu, and I click the import value from module, and then I'll automatically add the import. So I'll probably be doing that throughout the series, so that is how you can do that. Alright, so the first thing that I want to talk about is what's going on whenever we type a change. So if we go back to the sample code, this onChange function is what's passed to the editor. And notice the first thing they do is they update the state, which we're already doing. But the second thing they do is if it's not a remote change, that's what they're checking for, aka a different editor didn't trigger the change, they're calling this.props.onChange. Now if we come down here, we can see what that's doing. So they have this function called this.onToChange and this.onOneChange, which basically they do the same thing. So we can just look at one of them. So basically it is filtering through the operation that happened. So if they hit the keystroke K, for example, it is looking and it's filtering out some of the operations. So for example, if I come over here, if I click and focus, that is considered an operation. And we can see that if we come into the onChange here, and I console.log operation. So we can see every time the onChange is getting called. So you can see as I just click around with my cursor, an operation gets triggered. Also when I start typing, an operation gets triggered. So we can choose which operations we want all the editors to get. So at first we want to filter out the set selection stuff because we don't really need it. So that's the first part, is they are editing some of the stuff down because we don't need it. You'll notice they're also saying adding a different or an attribute to the operation, and this is who created the source. So for example, in this case, it came from the first editor. And then they're calling this.to.apply operations. And they're putting it in a set timeout. I'm not exactly sure why they're doing that. They may be waiting for a promise to resolve or something. We'll see whether or not we're going to need that and see if we get any problems if we don't include it. So basically, whenever the first editor makes a change, it's going to filter some of the ones they don't want, and it's going to call that operation on the second editor. So if we see what apply does, we can come over here. I think it's at the very top. So apply operations, it says this.remote, it sets it to true because it's a remote operation that's getting triggered. We're going to loop through the operations because there may be more than one that the remote has done, and we're going to apply them on the current editor. And then we're going to say remote is false. All right, so this is the gist of what we're about to implement. So let's start one step at a time. The first thing is we want to create two references. One, check whether we're currently getting a remote change, and the second, get the reference to the editor. So I'm going to say const editor use ref, and it's going to be null by default. We're also going to have a remote, and we're just going to plug the reference here to editor. And so now we can access editor.current, and it may possibly be null. And I also want to get the type definition for it, so I'm going to say editor here, editor or null. And you'll notice I put an exclamation point here. This is a TypeScript thing to declare that it is not null. And I can call apply operation or do whatever I want on it. So that's how we get reference to the editor. And so the way we're going to do it is instead of calling it in a callback here, kind of like where they are rendering two syncing editors, they're keeping reference to the first editor and the second editor. We're going to eliminate that and go more of the socket route, or what's similar to how we're going to do WebSockets, which is an event emitter. So that is what how we're going to implement this, where basically we can listen for changes that the other editor does. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use a library called mit. So this is just a library that is very small and basically implements pub/sub, which is basically WebSockets, what we're going to use for those. So this is going to be very, very similar, and the code to translate over is going to be very easy. So let's go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to say yarn add mit. It comes with TypeScript definitions, so we don't need to do anything else. So I'm going to import mit from mit, and we're going to create a new emitter. And so basically, we want to subscribe to changes whenever this first renders. So we're going to say use effect. And we're going to say emitter.on. And here I want to listen for all changes. And we're just going to say change happened here. And I'm going to comment out remote for now because we don't need that. And so the idea is in the on change here, I'm going to say emitter.emit, and then we're going to say the type. So we're going to give it a name at a later point. I'm just going to say something for now. And what are we going to emit? We're going to emit the following. If we come back to what they're doing here, this thing right here. So we're going to say options.operations, and then we get ops back. So this can possibly be undefined, so we're getting some problems with this here. One way we can do this is we can just say if O exists, we're going to return it, and that way we check whether O is defined or not. Otherwise, we can just return O, it's undefined. Or I guess we should say false, because we're doing filter, we have to return true or false whether to keep it. So we're going to check whether it's defined. If it is, we're going to do these conditions here. Down here, it looks like O can be anything, so we're going to say any. And these operations are what we're going to emit. So now if I come to my example here, we can see a change has occurred, space, more changes have happened. Now you'll notice events are emitting whenever I click somewhere, and we don't necessarily want to do that. So what we can say is if options.length, if there are some operations in the list, because we're going to filter them out. So if it's an empty list, we don't want to actually emit anything. So as we type, we can see changes happening. So we have 19 changes. Now if I click here anywhere, we're not emitting any changes. All right, so really the next thing to do is we need to keep some sort of ID so we don't make a change and just infinitely recur. And so what I mean by that is I don't want to say add X, this emits an event, and then we apply that operation to our own editor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an ID, and I'm going to say use ref. And the way I'm going to create this ID is just say date.now, which is going to give us the date and a number. And so that's what I'm just going to use for the ID, and I'm just going to make it a string. Later on, we might make a better ID, but this will work for now. And this ID is what I'm going to emit. So each editor that we create is going to have a different ID, and it's going to be id.current because this is a reference. So each one's going to have a different ID. So now we can know which ID or which editor is emitting an event. And so we can say if id.current is equal to the type, then we know this is the same event, it's the same editor, and we can ignore it. So we only want to make a change. We only want to do something if the IDs don't match up. So here, change happened in other editor. And we can see this if we try displaying two editors. So if I type here, it says change happened in an other editor, and you'll notice only one trigger happens. If I don't add this line of code, what's going to happen is when I make A there, you'll notice two events get triggered here and here. So we only want one. We only want this to happen in one time, or really as many editors as we have, except for the editor that we're currently making a change on. Okay, the other thing is the editors are kind of hard to see, so I thought we'd add some styling real quick. So I'm going to say style background color, FA, and I'm going to say max width 800 and min height 150. That way we can just see them a little bit better. And maybe we can add a line break between these. And cool, so we have some separation between that editor. So as I'm typing, we can see events are being emitted, and we can see these events and listen for them in other editors. So now if I do 3 editors, right, so let's clear this. If I press A twice, that event gets sent here and it gets sent here. So it's a total of 2 console logs. And that's exactly what we want. So really the last step is after I make this, after I type that, the event is being sent to both of these guys. We just need to take that event operations and apply it to the editor. All right, so this is where we're going to copy the code that we had here. And actually, we don't even have to copy it. I think it was like one line. I think we just say operations. And by the way, whatever we emit here, this value and then this value, we get here and here. So the ID and the operations is going to be second. Now I noticed the type definitions looked a little off on the emitter. So I am just going to cast this to anything just to avoid the problems with that. And then here I'm going to say this is a string and this is anything. Or you know what, I could hover over this and I could see its exact value. I guess it's anything here. This looks like it's a list of operation. I could maybe do this. And we can import that from Slate. So then here I'm going to say operations.forEach, and we're going to say editor.current.apply operation. And now I mentioned that, well, I didn't mention this, but we saw it right here, is whenever we call apply operations, we wrap it in remote. So we're going to say remote.current is set equal to true. Now it's false. And I said use ref is null here. It should be by default false. And the reason why we're wrapping this is we want to know if this is a remote operation that gets applied, because the onChange is going to get called, and we don't want to emit another event if this is a remote operation. So I'm going to say remote.current. So if the change that occurred was not a selection, that means there are some operations in here, and it was not a remote operation, it's local to the editor, then we are going to emit the change. All right, so let's see what this looks like now. So we have our three editors, and we're going to say hello, and we can see now the operations are applied between all of them, and this works no matter which editor I'm typing in. So pretty cool. So that is the gist of it, of how we can send data between these three editors. Now this might have been a little confusing with the emitter and sending stuff back and forth. I think it is a little bit more confusing using maybe emitter and keeping it all locally. I think this will make a little bit more sense when we switch this over to Socket.io in the next video. And we're basically going to do a similar technique though. We're going to listen for socket events that would happen, and we're going to emit our own socket events whenever we make a change in our local editor. So that's it for this video, guys. The code for this is going to be on GitHub if you want to check it out. I recommend playing around with this. You can try emitting different changes, or maybe not catching some of those changes. And the other cool thing is, now that we have this set up with Slate, we can do a lot more than just copy and deleting code. So for example here, they're able to say bold something, and it's bolded in both places. So we haven't added this quite yet. We've only started with typing a word, but we will get to that point where we are doing the same thing, because we have the framework to do that now.